The rain poured down heavily on the dark London street as Officer Sarah Mitchell pulled her patrol car to the curb. Her partner, David Chen, squinted through the windshield at the figure slumped against the brick wall of an old warehouse. At first glance, it looked like another homeless person seeking shelter from the storm, but something seemed different about this one. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the pouring rain. The cold water immediately soaked through her uniform as she approached the figure. David followed close behind, his hand instinctively resting on his radio. As they got closer, Sarah's flashlight beam revealed a sight that made her stop in her tracks. The man was dressed in what appeared to be a formal military uniform, though it was torn and covered in mud and blood. His hands were cuffed behind his back with standard police handcuffs, and his face was badly bruised and swollen. Blood dripped from a cut above his eye, mixing with the rain that ran down his face. He was conscious but barely, his eyes struggling to focus on the officers approaching him. Sarah immediately radioed for an ambulance while David knelt beside the man, checking for serious injuries. The man's breathing was labored and he winced in pain with each movement. His uniform, despite its damaged state, looked expensive and well-made. There were strange insignias on the shoulders that neither officer recognized. David carefully examined the handcuffs. They were standard issue, the kind police used every day, but there was no identification on them. No department markings, no serial numbers that could be traced. Someone had professionally restrained this man and left him here to die in the rain. The man's lips moved slightly, trying to form words, but no sound came out. Sarah leaned closer, trying to hear what he was saying, but the rain and thunder drowned out any whisper. She noticed his hands were blue from the tight cuffs cutting off circulation. Without hesitation, she retrieved her handcuff key and carefully removed them, allowing blood to flow back into his hands. As the cuffs came off, the man's fingers twitched and he let out a small groan of pain. Sarah noticed something else now that caught her attention. Around his neck, partially hidden by the torn collar of his uniform, was a small medallion. It looked official, important, but she had never seen anything like it before. The ambulance sirens grew louder as they approached. David was already on his phone reporting the incident to their sergeant. This was no ordinary assault case. The uniform, the formal handcuffs, the medallion, everything pointed to something bigger than a simple street crime. Sarah took several photos with her phone, documenting the scene before the paramedics arrived. When the ambulance pulled up, 2 paramedics rushed over with a stretcher and medical equipment. They quickly assessed the man's condition, finding multiple broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, and severe dehydration. One paramedic noticed the uniform and raised an eyebrow at Sarah, silently questioning what they had stumbled upon. As they loaded the unconscious man onto the stretcher, something fell from his torn jacket pocket. David picked it up and held it under his flashlight. It was a small leather wallet, expensive-looking, with gold embossing on the front. He opened it carefully, expecting to find identification, but instead found only a single card. The card was cream-colored with gold lettering, and it bore a symbol that made David's heart skip a beat. Sarah looked over his shoulder at the card. Neither of them could read the text. It appeared to be in a foreign language, but the symbol was unmistakable. It was a crown. Not just any crown, but one they had seen before in history books and news reports. This was the royal crest of a European monarchy. The paramedics wheeled the man toward the ambulance, and Sarah quickly told them they would follow to the hospital. As they climbed back into their patrol car, both officers sat in stunned silence for a moment. David finally spoke, his voice uncertain and confused. He suggested they might have just found someone important, possibly very important. Sarah started the engine, her mind racing with possibilities. Who was this man? Why was he handcuffed and beaten? And most importantly, why was he abandoned in a random London alley in the middle of the night? As they followed the ambulance through the rainy streets, Sarah's police radio crackled to life. Their sergeant wanted a full report immediately. She picked up the radio and began explaining what they had found, carefully describing the uniform, the medallion, and the card with the royal crest. There was a long pause on the other end before the sergeant responded. His voice was serious, more serious than Sarah had ever heard it. He told them to stay with the victim at all costs and not to let anyone near him without proper identification. He was making some calls and people would be arriving soon. Important people. Sarah and David exchanged worried glances as they continued following the ambulance through the dark, wet streets of London. At the hospital, the man was rushed into the emergency room. Sarah and David stood outside the door, suddenly feeling the weight of their discovery. Hospital staff rushed around them, but the two officers remained focused on their duty. They had no idea who this man was, but they knew one thing for certain. They had stumbled upon something that was about to change everything, and their simple night patrol had just become the most important assignment of their careers. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos as doctors and nurses worked on the mysterious patient. Sarah and David stood guard outside the treatment room, their wet uniforms dripping water onto the hospital floor. Neither had spoken much since arriving, both lost in thought about what they had discovered in that dark alley. 20 minutes passed before a man in an expensive suit arrived at the hospital. He walked with purpose and authority, his shoes clicking sharply on the tile floor. He approached the two officers without introducing himself, his eyes scanning them with a professional assessment that made Sarah instinctively straighten her posture. The man showed them a badge that neither officer had seen before. It was not a police badge or any government identification they recognized. The badge was silver with intricate designs and bore the same crown symbol they had seen on the card found with the victim. The man's accent was British but refined, the kind that suggested private schools and high society. He thanked them for their quick response and asked detailed questions about where and how they found the victim. Sarah provided every detail she could remember while David pulled out his phone to show the photos he had taken at the scene. The suited man studied each image carefully, his expression remaining neutral but his eyes betraying concern. More people began arriving at the hospital. First came two men in dark suits who positioned themselves at either end of the corridor. Then a woman with short gray hair and sharp features emerged from the elevator, speaking rapidly in a foreign language on her phone. She wore a simple black dress with a small pin on her collar, another crown symbol. Sarah was starting to understand that they had stumbled into something far beyond a typical assault case. These people moved with military precision, and their presence commanded respect from everyone in the hospital. Even the senior doctors seemed to defer to them without question. The first suited man finally introduced himself as Commander Wesley Price from a special security division. He explained nothing more about his role or organization, but his tone made it clear he was now in charge of the situation. He asked both officers to accompany him to a private waiting room down the hall. In the quiet room, away from the hospital activity, Commander Price sat across from Sarah and David. His expression softened slightly as he began to explain the gravity of what they had discovered. The man they found was not just anyone. He was Captain Henrik Anderson, a senior member of the Royal Guard of a small but significant European nation. Commander Price explained that Captain Anderson had been in London for a confidential security summit. He was supposed to return to his hotel after an evening meeting, but he never arrived. His disappearance had triggered immediate concern at the highest levels of government. Multiple agencies had been searching for him for the past 6 hours. The fact that he was found handcuffed and beaten suggested this was not a random attack. Someone had targeted him specifically, someone who knew his movements and his importance. Commander Price's voice grew more serious as he explained the implications. This could be an act of international terrorism, espionage, or worse. Sarah asked the obvious question that had been bothering her since they found the captain. Why would someone attack a member of a royal guard and then leave him alive? If this was an assassination attempt, it made no sense to handcuff him and abandon him in an alley. Commander Price nodded slowly, acknowledging that this question troubled him as well. He suggested several possibilities. Perhaps the attackers were interrupted before they could finish. Maybe they wanted information from him first and the beating was an interrogation, or possibly this was meant to send a message, a warning to someone else. Whatever the reason, they needed Captain Anderson to wake up and tell them what happened. At that moment, a doctor entered the waiting room. She was the lead emergency physician treating Captain Anderson, and her expression was grave. The captain had 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe dehydration, and significant blood loss. He also showed signs of electrical burns on his chest and arms, suggesting he had been tortured. The doctor continued with more disturbing news. Blood tests revealed traces of a powerful sedative in his system, something not available in standard hospitals or pharmacies. This was a military-grade drug used in special operations. Someone had professionally subdued him before the beating began. Commander Price stood and thanked the doctor, asking how long before the captain would be conscious. The doctor estimated at least 12 hours, possibly longer depending on how his body responded to treatment. They had stabilized him, but his recovery would take time. After the doctor left, Commander Price turned to Sarah and David with an unexpected request. He wanted them to remain involved in this case. They were the ones who found Captain Anderson, and their quick actions likely saved his life. More importantly, they were outside the normal diplomatic and security channels, which might prove valuable in the investigation. Sarah felt both honored and terrified by this request. This was far beyond anything she had trained for as a patrol officer. David seemed equally uncertain, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. But Commander Price insisted. He needed people he could trust, people who stumbled into this situation by accident rather than being part of any complex political game. He explained that the next few days would be critical. Someone had attacked a foreign royal guard on British soil. This could create an international incident if not handled properly. Multiple intelligence agencies were already involved, and political pressure was mounting. They needed to find out who did this and why before the situation escalated. Sarah asked about the handcuffs. Commander Price's jaw tightened at the question. The handcuffs were British police issue, which complicated everything. Either the attackers had access to police equipment or worse, someone within the police force was involved. This possibility made everyone uncomfortable. The implications were staggering. If police equipment was used in an attack on a foreign dignitary, it could suggest corruption or infiltration within law enforcement. Every agency would now be under suspicion. Trust would evaporate, and the investigation would become exponentially more difficult. Commander Price's phone buzzed, and he stepped away to take the call. Sarah and David sat in silence, processing everything they had just learned. What started as a routine patrol in the rain had transformed into an international crisis. They were now part of something much bigger than themselves, something that could have consequences they could barely imagine. When Commander Price returned, his expression was even more serious than before. He had just received confirmation that Captain Anderson's disappearance was now being investigated at the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister had been briefed, and diplomatic channels with the captain's home country were working overtime to manage the situation. He looked at both officers with grave intensity and made one thing absolutely clear. Everything they had seen and heard tonight was now classified. They could not discuss this case with anyone, not their colleagues, not their families, not even their sergeant, beyond basic information. The security of multiple nations might depend on their discretion. Morning light streamed through the hospital windows, but Sarah had not slept at all. She and David had remained at the hospital throughout the night, taking turns watching the corridor, while Captain Anderson remained unconscious in the intensive care unit. Commander Price had left around midnight but returned at dawn with coffee and breakfast for the two officers. The hospital had been transformed overnight. What was once a normal emergency ward had become a high-security facility. Plainclothes security personnel were stationed at every entrance, and the entire floor had been cleared of other patients. Hospital staff were vetted and required special clearance to access the area. Sarah had never seen anything like it. Commander Price briefed them on developments from the night. Security footage from the area where they found Captain Anderson was being analyzed. Investigators had found tire tracks and footprints, suggesting at least 3 people were involved in dumping him there. Forensic teams were processing evidence, but whoever did this was professional. They left almost nothing behind. More disturbing was what investigators discovered about Captain Anderson's evening. He had attended a security conference at a government building, left at approximately 8 in the evening, and was supposed to take a diplomatic car back to his hotel. The car and driver were found abandoned 3 miles from the conference center. The driver was unconscious but alive, drugged with the same sedative found in the captain's blood. Sarah asked the obvious question. How did the attackers know the captain's schedule and route? Commander Price's expression darkened. That was exactly what troubled everyone involved in the investigation. This level of detailed information suggested either a security breach or inside help. Every person who knew the captain's movements was now being investigated. A nurse emerged from the ICU with an update. Captain Anderson was showing signs of waking up. His vital signs were improving, and he had briefly opened his eyes before falling back into deep sleep. The doctors expected him to regain full consciousness within the next few hours. Everyone tensed at this news. Soon they would have answers. Commander Price instructed Sarah and David to be present when the captain woke up. He wanted the captain to see familiar faces, the people who found him and saved his life. This might help him feel secure enough to talk about what happened. Trust would be essential in getting the full story. As they waited, a new person arrived on the floor. She was a woman in her late 50s, dressed impeccably in a navy suit with perfectly styled blonde hair. She carried herself with an air of absolute authority that made even Commander Price stand a bit straighter. She introduced herself simply as Ambassador Christensen, representing the captain's home country. The ambassador spoke with a lilting accent, her English perfect, but distinctly foreign. She thanked Sarah and David personally for saving one of her nation's finest soldiers. Her gratitude seemed genuine, and her eyes glistened with emotion when she spoke about Captain Anderson. Clearly, he was not just a guard, but someone important to her personally. Ambassador Christensen explained more about Captain Anderson's role. He was not just any royal guard. He was the personal protection officer for the Crown Prince, one of the youngest members of the royal family. The captain had served in this role for 8 years and was trusted implicitly by the royal household. His expertise in security and unwavering loyalty made him irreplaceable. This information added another layer of complexity to the situation. If someone attacked the Crown Prince's personal guard, was this a message to the prince himself? Was there a larger plot against the royal family? Ambassador Christensen admitted these questions haunted her and her government. They needed answers urgently. Sarah noticed something in the ambassador's demeanor, a hesitation when she spoke about threats. David caught it too and gently pressed for more information. After a moment of consideration, Ambassador Christensen revealed something classified. There had been recent intelligence suggesting possible threats against members of the royal family, but nothing concrete enough to act on. This attack might be connected to those vague warnings. The revelation sent chills down Sarah's spine. They were not just dealing with a random assault. This could be part of a conspiracy against an entire royal household. The stakes were higher than anyone had initially thought. International relations, royal security, and potential terrorism all converged in the unconscious man lying in the hospital bed. At 10 in the morning, a doctor emerged from the ICU with the news everyone had been waiting for. Captain Anderson was awake and asking to speak with someone. His memory was fragmented and he was in considerable pain, but he was conscious and coherent enough to communicate. Commander Price, Ambassador Christensen, Sarah and David entered the ICU together. The room was filled with monitoring equipment, all beeping and whirring softly. Captain Anderson lay in the bed, his face still swollen and bruised, but his eyes were open and alert. When he saw the group entering, he tried to sit up but winced in pain and fell back against the pillows. Ambassador Christensen approached the bed first, speaking to him in their native language. Her voice was gentle, reassuring. The captain responded in the same language, his voice weak but determined. They spoke for several minutes before the ambassador turned to translate for the others. Captain Anderson remembered leaving the conference. He got into the diplomatic car as planned, but within minutes of driving, he noticed the driver behaving strangely. Before he could react, he felt a sharp pain in his neck. Someone had injected him with something from behind. He realized there was a second person in the car, hidden in the back seat. The captain tried to fight back, but the drug worked quickly. His muscles went numb and his vision blurred. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was being pulled from the car. He had no memory of the beating or being handcuffed. Everything after the injection was blank until he woke up in the hospital. Commander Price asked specific questions. Did he see the face of his attacker? Did he hear any voices or conversations? Did anyone ask him questions during the attack? The captain shook his head weakly. Everything happened too fast. The person who injected him wore a mask and he heard no voices he could identify. But then Captain Anderson remembered something else, something that made everyone in the room lean forward. Just before the injection, he heard a phrase spoken in English with a distinct accent. 3 words. Remember the protocol? That was all, but the captain emphasized those words were spoken deliberately, as if they were a message. Commander Price and Ambassador Christensen exchanged meaningful glances. Remember the protocol could mean many things, but in security and royal protection services, protocols were everything. Every situation had a specific protocol, a set of procedures to follow. Was someone reminding the captain of a protocol or warning him about one? Sarah asked if the phrase meant anything specific to him. The captain thought carefully before responding through the ambassador. In royal protection, there were dozens of protocols for different situations. But one protocol stood out in his mind: the emergency succession protocol. This was the procedure followed if something happened to a member of the royal family, particularly someone in direct line to the throne. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If someone was referencing the emergency succession protocol, they might be planning something against the royal family. The attack on Captain Anderson might not have been the main objective. It might have been a warning or a distraction from a larger threat. Ambassador Christensen immediately stepped out of the room to make urgent phone calls. Commander Price's expression was grim as he considered the possibilities. Sarah and David looked at each other, realizing they had uncovered something far more dangerous than a simple assault. They had stumbled into what might be a conspiracy against an entire monarchy, and time was running out to stop whatever was planned next. Within an hour of Captain Anderson mentioning the emergency succession protocol, the hospital floor transformed into something resembling a military command center. Laptop computers were set up in a converted waiting room, secure phone lines were installed, and more security personnel arrived. Sarah and David found themselves in the middle of an international crisis response. Ambassador Christensen returned from her phone calls looking shaken but determined. She gathered everyone for an emergency briefing. The royal family had been immediately moved to secure locations. The Crown Prince, whom Captain Anderson normally protected, was now surrounded by triple the usual security detail. All public appearances for the next week were canceled, and the palace was on complete lockdown. Commander Price received updates from his team investigating the attack. They had identified the diplomatic car used that night and found traces of the sedative used on both Captain Anderson and his driver. More importantly, they found something else in the car: a small electronic device hidden under the passenger seat. It was a tracker, sophisticated and expensive, definitely not something ordinary criminals would use. The tracker had been active for 3 days before the attack, meaning someone had been monitoring Captain Anderson's movements for at least that long. This confirmed the attack was carefully planned and executed with precision. The attackers knew exactly where he would be and when. They had studied his patterns and waited for the perfect moment. Sarah listened to all this information with growing unease. She kept thinking about those handcuffs. British police issue handcuffs. Someone with access to police equipment was involved in this conspiracy. The thought made her stomach turn. If there was corruption within law enforcement, who could they trust? David was thinking along the same lines and voiced the concern to Commander Price. The commander acknowledged this was their biggest problem. They could not conduct a normal investigation because they did not know who might be compromised. Every move had to be calculated carefully. Every person involved had to be thoroughly vetted. A forensic expert arrived with analysis of the handcuffs found on Captain Anderson. The news was not good. The cuffs were traced to a batch issued to the Metropolitan Police 3 years ago. However, that batch was part of a shipment that had been partially lost in transit. 50 pairs of handcuffs were never accounted for and were written off as missing. Someone could have obtained them from that missing shipment. This was slightly better news than having a corrupt officer involved, but only slightly. It meant someone had access to police supply chains or had connections to people who did. The web of conspiracy was growing more complex. Sarah wondered how deep this went and how many people might be involved. Captain Anderson requested to speak with Sarah and David alone. Commander Price was hesitant, but the ambassador convinced him. The captain specifically asked for the officers who found him, and his cooperation was essential. They needed him to remember every detail he could about the attack. In the ICU room, Captain Anderson looked directly at Sarah with intense blue eyes despite his injuries. He thanked them both in accented English for saving his life. Without them, he would have died in that alley. He wanted them to know their quick thinking and compassion gave him a second chance. Then the captain said something unexpected. He told them he thought the attackers wanted him to be found. They left him in a location where he would be discovered, handcuffed but alive. If they wanted him dead, they could have easily killed him. Instead, they left him as a message. The question was, a message to whom? Sarah had not considered this possibility. She asked the captain who would understand such a message. He struggled to answer, clearly frustrated by gaps in his memory. But he mentioned something about a meeting that happened before the conference, an informal discussion with other security professionals from various countries. They talked about upcoming royal events and potential security concerns. David asked if anything unusual happened at that meeting. The captain thought carefully, his bruised face showing concentration. Yes, something did stand out. One person at the meeting, a representative from a private security firm, asked very specific questions about the emergency succession protocol. At the time, it seemed like professional curiosity. Now, in light of everything, it seemed suspicious. Commander Price was immediately notified of this information. He sent team members to investigate this private security firm and the representative who attended that meeting. Every lead, no matter how small, needed to be followed. Time was critical if they wanted to prevent whatever was being planned. As the day progressed, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The driver of the diplomatic car regained consciousness and provided his account. He remembered picking up Captain Anderson from the conference. Almost immediately after starting the drive, his coffee flask, which he had filled earlier, made him feel strange. He realized too late that his coffee had been drugged. The last thing he remembered was pulling over and someone opening his door. This meant the attackers had access to the driver's coffee before the evening even began. They had infiltrated the conference venue or the driver's preparation area. Security at the conference was supposed to be airtight, yet somehow someone got through. This suggested either extremely skilled operatives or inside help. Ambassador Christensen received a disturbing call from her government. Intelligence services had intercepted communications, suggesting a major operation was planned for the end of the week. The intercepted messages were coded, but analysts believed they referenced a royal event. The problem was all public royal events were now canceled. What event were they targeting? Captain Anderson suddenly remembered something else. The Crown Prince had a private engagement scheduled, something not on the public calendar. A charity visit to a children's hospital, planned months in advance. Only a handful of people knew about it. The prince insisted on keeping some engagements private to avoid media circus around sick children. That event was scheduled for 3 days from now. Everyone in the room realized simultaneously that this might be the target. A private event with minimal security awareness, perfect for an attack. But now that they knew, they had a chance to prevent it. Commander Price immediately began coordinating with the prince's current security team to reinforce protection for that event. However, Ambassador Christensen raised a crucial point. If they simply canceled the hospital visit, the conspirators would know their plot had been discovered. They might go underground and plan something else later when everyone's guard was down, or worse, they might have a backup plan ready to execute immediately. Commander Price proposed a bold alternative. Let the hospital visit proceed as planned, but turn it into a trap for the conspirators. Flood the area with undercover security, monitor every person who comes near the hospital, and wait for the attackers to reveal themselves. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to catch everyone involved. Sarah felt her heart racing as she listened to these plans. They were discussing using the Crown Prince as bait to catch terrorists or assassins. One wrong move could result in tragedy. David looked equally concerned, but both officers understood the logic. Sometimes you had to take calculated risks to prevent greater harm. The next 48 hours would be critical. They needed to prepare the trap perfectly while making everything appear normal. Captain Anderson would remain in the hospital, officially listed as an unidentified assault victim. His presence in London would be kept secret. Meanwhile, security teams would prepare for the hospital visit, ready for anything. As evening approached, Sarah and David were finally relieved from their watch. They had been awake for over 30 hours, running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee. Commander Price thanked them for their dedication and told them to get some rest. They would need to be sharp for what was coming. Walking out of the hospital into the cool evening air, Sarah and David barely spoke. They were both processing everything that had happened in the last day and a half. A routine patrol in the rain had led them into an international conspiracy. They had become part of something much bigger than themselves, and the weight of responsibility was overwhelming. As they drove back to the station, Sarah could not shake a feeling of dread. They had uncovered a plot against a royal family member, but how many other things might they have missed? Were there other players involved that they had not identified? The pieces were coming together, but the picture was still incomplete and time was running out. Sarah barely slept during her time off. Her mind kept replaying every detail of finding Captain Anderson in that alley. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his bruised face and the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. When her alarm went off after just 4 hours of restless sleep, she was almost relieved to get back to work. She met David at a secure briefing room at their station. Commander Price was already there with several other officials she had not met before. They represented various intelligence and security agencies, all working together on what was now being called Operation Royal Shield. The room buzzed with quiet intensity as everyone prepared for the upcoming hospital visit. Commander Price laid out the plan on a large screen. The children's hospital where the Crown Prince would visit had been transformed into a security fortress, but invisibly. Every staff member had been background checked. Plainclothed officers would pose as doctors, nurses, and visitors. Rooftop snipers would cover every angle. Electronic surveillance would monitor all communications in the area. The Crown Prince had been briefed and agreed to proceed with the visit despite the danger. His security team protested, but the prince insisted. These children had been waiting months to meet him, and he refused to let terrorists control his life through fear. Ambassador Christensen admitted the prince's bravery was admirable, but terrifying given the circumstances. Sarah and David were assigned to be inside the hospital during the visit, dressed as civilian visitors. Their role was to observe and report anything suspicious. Commander Price specifically wanted them involved because they were the ones who started this investigation. They knew details others might miss. Their fresh perspective could prove valuable. The briefing revealed new intelligence gathered overnight. The private security firm whose representative asked suspicious questions had been thoroughly investigated. The company appeared legitimate on the surface, but deeper digging revealed connections to a radical political group opposed to monarchies in general. They believed royal families were outdated and wanted to see them abolished across Europe. This political angle added another dimension to the threat. They were not dealing with random criminals or foreign agents. They were facing ideological extremists who believed they were fighting for a cause. These were often the most dangerous type of adversaries because they were willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. The representative from the security firm, identified as Marcus Weber, had disappeared 2 days ago. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected, and his car found abandoned at a train station. He was clearly involved and had gone into hiding after the attack on Captain Anderson. Finding him was now a top priority. Intelligence analysts discovered something else disturbing. Marcus Weber had a brother who worked in police logistics. This brother, Thomas Weber, had access to equipment storage and supply chains. He was likely the source of the police handcuffs used on Captain Anderson. Thomas was picked up for questioning overnight and was currently being interrogated. Sarah felt a mix of relief and concern. Relief that the handcuffs were not evidence of widespread corruption in the police force, just one compromised individual. Concern because if Thomas Weber provided his brother with handcuffs, what else might he have supplied? Weapons, information, access codes? David asked about Thomas Weber's interrogation. Commander Price said the man was cooperating, but claimed ignorance about his brother's true intentions. Thomas admitted giving Marcus some handcuffs months ago, when Marcus said he needed them for a private security training exercise. He also provided information about police patrol patterns and shift schedules. Thomas had not realized he was helping plan an attack. The day of the hospital visit arrived with tense anticipation. Sarah dressed in casual clothes, trying to look like a normal visitor. She wore a small earpiece hidden by her hair, keeping her connected to the security network. David was similarly equipped. They arrived at the hospital separately and positioned themselves in different areas to cover more ground. The children's hospital was a bright, cheerful place despite the serious illnesses being treated there. Colorful murals decorated the walls, and staff members wore cartoon character scrubs to make young patients smile. Sarah felt sick thinking that someone wanted to bring violence to this place of healing and hope. She walked through corridors slowly, observing everyone. Most people appeared normal, focused on sick children or medical duties. But Sarah had been trained to spot things out of place. A man in a maintenance uniform who seemed too interested in security cameras. A woman in nurse's scrubs who did not interact with any patients or staff. Small details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. Through her earpiece, she heard constant updates from the security team. The Crown Prince's motorcade was 10 minutes away. All checkpoints reported normal status. Rooftop units had clear sightlines. Electronic surveillance detected no unusual communications. Everything seemed fine, but Sarah's instinct screamed that something was wrong. David's voice came through the earpiece. He spotted someone in the parking garage who seemed to be watching the entrance rather than walking to a car. Security cameras confirmed a man had been standing in the same spot for 15 minutes, occasionally speaking on a phone. A team was dispatched to question him. The Crown Prince arrived with minimal fanfare. He was younger than Sarah expected, probably in his late 20s, with a kind face and genuine smile. Despite knowing his life was in danger, he showed no fear as he entered the hospital. His security detail surrounded him, but he still made an effort to greet everyone warmly. Sarah watched from a distance as the prince began visiting children's rooms. His interactions were touching, full of laughter and encouragement. He listened to each child's story, looked at their drawings, and promised to remember them. For a moment, Sarah almost forgot this was a trap to catch terrorists. Then everything happened at once. The man in the parking garage pulled a gun when security approached him. Shots were fired. The prince's security detail immediately formed a protective barrier around him. Alarms sounded throughout the hospital. Sarah's training took over and she moved toward the prince's location, ready to help. But something felt wrong. The man in the garage was captured quickly, too quickly. He offered minimal resistance after firing a few shots that hit nothing important. David's voice came through the earpiece with a realization that sent chills down Sarah's spine. This was a distraction. The real threat was somewhere else. Commander Price's voice cut through the chaos on the communication channel. Everyone should hold positions and scan for secondary threats. The incident in the garage might be designed to draw security attention away from the actual attack point. Sarah spun around, looking at everyone near her with fresh suspicion. She saw him then. The man in the maintenance uniform she had noticed earlier was now moving purposefully toward a service elevator that would take him to the floor where the prince was visiting children. His hand was inside a toolbox he carried, and his eyes were locked on his destination with single-minded focus. Sarah spoke quickly into her earpiece, identifying the suspect and his location. She began following him, trying to appear casual but keeping him in sight. The man pressed the elevator button and waited, his body language tense. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and Sarah made a split-second decision. She rushed forward and entered the elevator just before the doors closed. They were alone in the small space. The man looked at her with surprise, then recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew she was security. His hand moved inside the toolbox and Sarah reacted instantly. She grabbed his wrist, preventing him from pulling out whatever weapon he had. They struggled in the confined space as the elevator began ascending. The man was strong and trained. He threw an elbow that caught Sarah in the ribs, knocking the wind from her lungs. But she held onto his wrist with iron determination. If he got that weapon out, people would die. The elevator climbed steadily toward the floor where the Crown Prince was located with dozens of sick children. Through gritted teeth, Sarah managed to activate the emergency stop button with her free hand. The elevator lurched to a halt between floors. The man cursed and tried to slam her against the wall, but the small space limited his movements. Sarah used this to her advantage, leveraging her position to twist his arm behind his back. Her earpiece had fallen out during the struggle, so she could not communicate with the security team. But they would see the elevator had stopped and send help. She just needed to hold him until they arrived. The man seemed to realize this too and fought with desperate strength. He managed to pull his hand free and finally retrieved what was in the toolbox. Sarah's heart sank when she saw it. Not a gun, but something worse. A small explosive device with a timer. He had been planning to plant it near the prince's location. The digital display showed it was already armed and counting down. 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The man smiled grimly and held the device away from her reach. He told her in a cold voice that she had two choices. Let him go and he would disarm it, or keep fighting and they would both die along with everyone above them when it exploded. Sarah's mind raced through options. She could not let him go, but she also could not let that bomb detonate. She made a decisio. The interrogation room was cold and sterile. Sarah sat across from the man who had nearly detonated a bomb in a children's hospital. His name was revealed to be Daniel Foster, a former military explosives expert who had become radicalized after leaving the service. He looked smaller now without the maintenance uniform, just a tired man who had almost made a terrible mistake. Commander Price conducted the interview with Sarah present. Daniel was cooperating fully, perhaps grateful that Sarah had talked him down before he became a mass murderer. He explained the entire conspiracy with disturbing detail. The group he worked with had been planning this attack for 6 months, carefully studying the Crown Prince's schedule and looking for the perfect opportunity. The attack on Captain Anderson had been necessary, according to Daniel, because the captain would have detected the security weaknesses they planned to exploit at the hospital. They needed him out of the way. The phrase "remember the protocol" was meant to mislead investigators into thinking this was about succession, distracting from the real target. It worked exactly as planned until Sarah and David found the captain too quickly. Daniel revealed there were 5 core members of the conspiracy: Marcus Weber, who coordinated everything; Thomas Weber, who provided police equipment and information; Daniel himself, the explosives expert; the man caught in the parking garage, whose name was revealed as Carl Stevens, meant to create the distraction; and one more person they had not yet identified, someone with deep access to royal security protocols. This 5th conspirator was the most dangerous because they were still unknown and at large. Daniel claimed he never met this person and only knew them by a code name, Raven. Marcus Weber was the only one who communicated directly with Raven. If they wanted to find this insider, they needed to find Marcus first. Commander Price asked Daniel about Marcus Weber's likely hiding places. Daniel thought carefully before answering. Marcus was meticulous and paranoid. He would have multiple safe houses prepared. But Daniel remembered Marcus mentioning a cousin who owned a remote cottage in Scotland. It was off the grid, no internet, no nearby neighbors. Perfect for hiding until things cooled down. Within hours, a team was dispatched to Scotland. Meanwhile, Sarah and David were sent back to the hospital to check on Captain Anderson. The captain had been following the operation remotely from his hospital bed and wanted to thank them personally for stopping the attack. Despite his injuries, he insisted on seeing them. Captain Anderson looked better than before, though still heavily bandaged. His eyes were clear and focused as Sarah and David entered his room. He spoke in English, his accent thick but his words sincere. He told them they had not only saved his life, but prevented a tragedy that would have devastated 2 nations. Their actions represented the best of what law enforcement could be. Ambassador Christensen was also present, and she had news. The Crown Prince wanted to meet Sarah and David personally. It was highly unusual for a royal family member to meet with foreign police officers, but the prince insisted. He felt he owed his life to their quick thinking and dedication. The meeting was arranged for the following day at a secure embassy location. Sarah felt overwhelmed by everything. She was just a patrol officer who happened to find an injured man in an alley. She never expected to become involved in stopping an international conspiracy. David seemed equally stunned by how much their lives had changed in just a few days. That evening, Sarah returned home for the first time in what felt like forever. Her small apartment seemed foreign, like she had been gone for months instead of days. She tried to relax, but her mind would not stop replaying events. The elevator struggle, the bomb counting down, Daniel's face when he chose to disarm it. Every moment remained vivid and intense. Her phone rang just as she was finally dozing off. It was Commander Price. The team in Scotland had found Marcus Weber's hiding place. There had been a confrontation, and Marcus was now in custody. He was refusing to cooperate, but they found his laptop with encrypted files. Tech specialists were working to break the encryption and hopefully identify Raven. Sarah asked if they were safe now. Commander Price paused before answering honestly. Until they identified and caught Raven, there was still danger. This insider knew all the security protocols, all the weaknesses in royal protection. They could try again, perhaps with a different target or method. No one could rest easy until Raven was caught. The next day, Sarah and David put on their dress uniforms and went to meet the Crown Prince. The embassy was a beautiful historic building with massive security. They were escorted through multiple checkpoints before reaching a private sitting room, decorated with portraits and expensive furniture. The Crown Prince entered with minimal fanfare, accompanied only by 2 bodyguards. He was dressed casually in a sweater and slacks, looking nothing like the formal royal images Sarah had seen in newspapers. He shook their hands warmly and asked them to sit. immediately putting them at ease with his relaxed demeanor. The prince thanked them for their service, but he did more than that. He asked about their lives, their families, what made them become police officers. He seemed genuinely interested in them as people, not just as the officers who saved him. Sarah found herself opening up about her reasons for joining the force, her hopes of making a difference in people's lives. David shared his own story about growing up in a rough neighborhood and seeing both the good and bad sides of policing. He wanted to be the kind of officer who built trust and helped communities rather than just enforcing rules. The prince listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own perspectives on leadership and service. After an hour of conversation, the prince became more serious. He told them that what happened at the hospital changed him. He always knew his position came with risks, but seeing how close he came to dying made everything more real. More importantly, seeing how close innocent children came to being hurt because of him made him reconsider many things. The prince revealed something personal. He admitted he sometimes took his security for granted, saw it as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. Captain Anderson had been trying to strengthen certain protocols for months, but the prince resisted because he wanted more freedom and privacy. If he had listened, maybe the attack could have been prevented entirely. Sarah appreciated his honesty but reminded him that he could not blame himself for the actions of extremists. The people who planned this attack made their own choices. His only responsibility was to learn from the experience and do better going forward. The prince smiled sadly and agreed, saying she was wise beyond her years. Before they left, the prince presented both Sarah and David with special commendations from his government. These were medals rarely given to foreigners, reserved for extraordinary service to the royal family. He pinned them on their uniforms personally and told them they would always be remembered with gratitude by his nation. As they left the embassy, Sarah felt a strange mix of pride and unease. They had accomplished something remarkable, but the job was not finished. Raven was still out there somewhere, a shadow threat they could not see or predict. Until this person was caught, the danger remained. Commander Price called again that evening with a breakthrough. The encryption on Marcus Weber's laptop had been cracked. Inside were detailed communications with Raven spanning 6 months. The tech team was analyzing everything, looking for clues to Raven's identity. They had narrowed it down to someone with high-level access to royal security, but that still left dozens of possibilities. One message stood out. Raven had written to Marcus just days before the hospital attack. The message said something cryptic about having to disappear for a while after the operation. Regardless of success or failure, too much exposure, too many questions. This suggested Raven knew their involvement, might be discovered and had an escape plan. Ready? Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Commander Price. They had identified Raven. The analysis of communication patterns, word choices, and specific knowledge revealed in the messages pointed to one person, someone they had all trusted, someone who had been part of the investigation from the beginning. The revelation was about to shock everyone involved, and Sarah's blood ran cold when she read the name. The name on Sarah's phone screen seemed impossible. Deputy Director Helena Morrison from the Royal Protection Command. She was a decorated officer with 20 years of exemplary service, someone who had built the very security protocols meant to keep the royal family safe. Sarah read the name 3 times, certain there must be a mistake. Commander Price called within seconds of sending the message. His voice was tight with controlled anger. The evidence was overwhelming. Helena Morrison had been feeding information to Marcus Weber for months. Her communications revealed deep bitterness about being passed over for promotion multiple times despite her dedication and expertise. She felt unappreciated, undervalued, and eventually that bitterness transformed into something darker. The conspiracy group had approached her carefully, first as sympathetic listeners to her complaints about the system, then gradually introducing their ideology about ending monarchies. Helena never planned to directly participate in violence. She convinced herself that providing information was just a form of protest, a way to expose the weaknesses in a system that had rejected her contributions. But information was exactly what the conspirators needed to plan their attack. Sarah felt sick. Helena Morrison had been at the hospital during the Crown Prince's visit. She had access to all the security plans, all the communication channels, She could have warned the conspirators about the trap being set for them. Why had she not done so? Commander Price had an answer. Helena's last message to Marcus was sent 2 days before the hospital visit, telling him the operation was compromised and he should abort. Marcus never responded. He had either not received the message or decided to proceed anyway. This meant Helena thought she had done enough to stop the attack while maintaining her cover. When it proceeded anyway, she had to play along with the security response to avoid suspicion. She had no idea that Marcus's laptop would be recovered with all their communications preserved. Now her entire betrayal was exposed. A tactical team was already moving to arrest Helena Morrison at her home. Commander Price wanted Sarah and David present during the interrogation. Their outsider perspective had been valuable throughout this investigation, and he trusted their judgment on whether Helena was telling the complete truth about her involvement. Helena Morrison's home was an ordinary suburban house with a well-maintained garden. Nothing about it suggested a traitor lived there. When tactical officers breached the door, they found Helena sitting calmly in her living room, a glass of wine in her hand. She did not resist arrest. She simply stood, set down her glass, and extended her wrists for handcuffs. She had been expecting this. At the interrogation facility, Helena sat across from Commander Price, Ambassador Christensen, Sarah, and David. Her expression was resigned but defiant. She admitted everything without hesitation. Yes, she had provided information to the conspiracy group. Yes, she knew they were planning an attack, but she insisted she tried to stop it when she realized how far they were willing to go. Commander Price was not interested in her justifications. He wanted to know everything she had shared with the conspirators. What other protocols had she compromised? Were there other attacks planned? Did she help anyone else who might still be a threat? Helena answered each question mechanically, her voice devoid of emotion. She revealed that the group had been planning multiple operations, but the hospital attack was supposed to be the first. If it succeeded, they would have moved on to other targets across Europe. Different royal families, different methods, all designed to create fear and undermine public confidence in monarchies. Helena had provided security information for 3 other potential operations, all now exposed and preventable. Sarah asked the question that had been bothering her since learning of Helena's betrayal. Why did she do it? Money? Ideology? Revenge? Helena looked directly at Sarah for the first time, and her carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. It was all of those things and none of them. She had devoted her life to protecting people she believed in, only to be told repeatedly she was not good enough to advance. Younger, less experienced officers were promoted over her. Her ideas were dismissed. Her contributions were overlooked. Helena continued, her voice gaining intensity. She began to question why she was protecting a system that did not value her. Why should she dedicate her life to people who were born into privilege, while she struggled for recognition despite her skills and dedication? The conspiracy group gave her something the Royal Protection Command never did. They listened to her, valued her knowledge, made her feel important. Ambassador Christensen spoke for the first time, her voice cold. She told Helena that ego and ambition did not excuse treason. Innocent children nearly died because of her wounded pride. Captain Anderson, a good man who served honorably, was tortured and left for dead. Helena's personal grievances did not justify the pain and suffering she helped cause. Helena's defiance crumbled at those words. She put her head in her hands and began to cry. She had not thought about the real consequences of her actions, only her abstract ideology and personal resentments. Seeing the results, understanding how close the attack came to succeeding, made her realize the enormity of what she had done. There was no justification, no excuse that could make it right. The interrogation continued for hours. Helena provided every detail she could remember about the conspiracy group's plans and connections. She gave names of sympathizers who were not directly involved but might provide support. She revealed funding sources and communication methods. By the end, investigators had a complete picture of the entire network. In the following days, dozens of arrests were made across Europe. The conspiracy was larger than anyone initially thought, with cells in 5 countries. Not all members were planning violence. Many were just providing support or spreading propaganda. But the core group that planned the hospital attack was completely dismantled. Without Helena's information, some of those members might have escaped and tried again. Captain Anderson made a full recovery and returned to his duties protecting the Crown Prince. He and Sarah stayed in touch, occasionally exchanging emails about their lives and work. The captain told her that the attack changed how royal protection operated. New protocols were implemented, security was strengthened, and more importantly, there was renewed focus on the well-being and recognition of security personnel. They did not want another Helena Morrison, someone so alienated they turned against everything they swore to protect. The Crown Prince kept his word about never forgetting Sarah and David. On the anniversary of the thwarted attack, he sent them personal letters thanking them again and updating them on the children from the hospital. Emma, the 6-year-old with leukemia, was in remission. James, the 10-year-old who wanted to be an astronaut, was getting stronger every day. Their lives had been saved by the actions of 2 patrol officers who simply did their jobs with dedication and compassion. Sarah returned to normal patrol duties, but nothing felt quite normal anymore. She had seen behind the curtain of international politics and royal protocol. She understood now that history was not just made by powerful people, but by ordinary individuals who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to do the right thing. David felt the same way. They often partnered on patrols now, driving through the same streets where they found Captain Anderson that rainy night. They talked about how much had changed and how much stayed the same. They were still patrol officers responding to calls and helping people. But they also knew that sometimes the most important moments came when you least expected them. Helena Morrison was sentenced to 20 years in prison for treason and conspiracy to commit terrorism. During her trial, she apologized publicly to Captain Anderson, the Crown Prince, and especially to the children who were nearly killed. Her apology seemed genuine, but it could not undo the damage she caused or the trust she betrayed. Her case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of bitterness and the importance of valuing people who serve faithfully. Marcus Weber and the other core conspirators received life sentences. Daniel Foster, who disarmed the bomb, received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He would spend 15 years in prison, but at least had a chance at redemption. His testimony helped convict the others and prevented future attacks. On quiet nights, Sarah sometimes thought about that moment in the elevator when Daniel held the armed bomb. She had gambled everything on her ability to reach him, to remind him of his humanity before he committed an unforgivable act. It worked, but she knew it easily could have failed. She could have died that day along with David, Commander Price, the Crown Prince, and dozens of children. The thin line between tragedy and triumph haunted her sometimes, but mostly she felt grateful. Grateful that she and David happened to be on patrol that rainy night. Grateful for the training and instincts that helped them make the right decisions under pressure. Grateful for the opportunity to make a real difference in the world, even if most people would never know the full story of what happened. The medal from the Crown Prince sat in a drawer at her home. She rarely looked at it, not because she was not proud, but because she did not need a medal to remember why she became a police officer. She joined to help people, to protect